It's been nearly 3 years since white nationalists marched on Charlottesville and intense protests erupted. But in this worldwide moment of protest, the city most often invoked with racially charged demonstrations is largely at peace. The Charlottesville Police Department, which has overseen some peaceful protests within the last week, implemented specific trainings in light of the unrest 3 years ago and utilizes additional approaches for the demonstrations now. Charlottesville Chief of Police Rochelle Brackney, who took the role in the summer of 2018 as the first African-American woman to serve as the city's chief of police, spoke with NBC News about how her department is approaching this moment, what was learned from 2017, and how she reconciles her own identity as a Black woman in law enforcement during this time.
Charlottesville has handled this protest, demonstration, civil discourse, engaging in social justice as a model that I think you could emulate across the nation. We had to see how the police and particularly their strategies may have been complicit in allowing violence to erupt here in 2017. So we took an absolutely different approach here. The approach was create a space where you could have free speech, freedom of speech, and where people could be heard, and really just pull back and have a soft policing presence. That has worked. The less police interventions there are, the less likely to have a negative outcome. So we've set up bicycles so that most of our officers, when they're part of these, they're on bicycles, they're on Segways. We're pulling away from using vehicles in those spaces. We're having a lot of conversations with the organizers prior to their organizations to say, how can we support that? And that's been extremely helpful.
So many of what the Black Lives Matter protesters are calling for is demilitarizing the police or even defunding the police. How do you reconcile that?
So I absolutely agree, demilitarizing the police departments. I think that you do have and will need some sort of policing presence. But that is really just a social contract that the police and that community needs to work through as to how they should and want to be policed and need to be policed, right? That has to be a co-production of that public safety where we all are part of that equation.
You're not only the first female police chief, you're also the first Black female police chief here. How do you approach that? How do you reconcile so much of what's going on?
Well, you know, it's always a balancing act. Particularly for women, minority women in any profession. And the way that I balance it is I call on this community and all the communities that when you have a minority person who's in the position, you know, you can't ostracize them in your community. The Black community cannot ostracize minority officers and push them away. The majority community has to support those. So my white male counterparts have an absolute obligation to support the work that we're doing. And then the community, when they're getting it right or when we're getting it right, they should acknowledge that so that they become the models for the rest of the nation. So we're here to break that chain of violence. We're here to break that chain of racism. And we're trying to do that from the inside out.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.